Hello, hello, hello.
Sorry, I'm running a couple of minutes behind.
Oh, that's completely fine. It's fine. Um, so we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Thank you, everybody, for attending the next installation in our series, the Street Riders Zoom panels. For those of you who don't know me, I am Rico Washington. I'm a member, the team lead, a team lead rather, of Street Riders NYC. If you're not sure who Riders NYC is, Street Riders NYC is a collective, a movement, and a community born in the streets of New York City that coalesced in protest and connected during the social unrest surrounding the police killings of unarmed Black citizens in the spring of 2020. Street Riders NYC has a collective interest in cycling to protest while providing cycling support and protection to other protest groups across the city, focusing on issues of justice for the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, as well as police reform, racial equality, and community direct action. If you're not already aware, you can follow us on all social media platforms. That would be Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Street Riders NYC. And I would like to welcome everyone and also welcome our panelists, thanking them for being so generous with their time today. First up, we have Maurice Chammah. And Maurice is a staff writer at the Marshall Project, which is an award-winning nonpartisan nonprofit news organization that seeks to create and sustain a sense of national urgency about the US criminal justice system. And he's also the author of Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty, which won the 2019 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Book Award. His work has been published by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. A former Fulbright Fellow, he helps organize the Insider Prize, which is a contest for incarcerated writers sponsored by the magazine American Short Fiction. He lives in Austin, Texas. We also have with us Kristina Roth, who is the Senior Advocate for Criminal Justice Programs at Amnesty International USA. She oversees the organization's work to abolish the death penalty and stop unlawful killings by Black people. Excuse me, unlawful killings by police. She also serves as the AIUSA's expert on these matters and works regularly with grassroots activists, impacted communities, elected officials, and other top stakeholders to put an end to these urgent human rights abuses. Kristina has represented the organization before the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism and racial discrimination, also xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance at the annual Fast and Vigil to Abolish the Death Penalty. Her analysis has appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Deutsche Welle, AJ Plus, and other outlets. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you all for attending, I said, the second panel installation. Today, we're going to be talking about the death penalty, capital punishment, and the Trump administration's connection to it. I know that we are now in a fully new administration, so we don't have as much to worry about with that administration anymore. However, it's important for us to talk about how the Trump administration has kind of accelerated the death penalty for the federal death penalty. So I'll just go ahead and start off with the obvious about Trump and the death penalty. Immediately after the arrest of the 5 Black and brown men who we now know as the exonerated 5 in 1989, Donald Trump famously ran a full-page ad in 4 New York City newspapers, which was effectively a clarion call for each of the wrongfully accused then teens to receive the death penalty in connection with the Central Park jogger case, which a lot of you may be familiar with. If you're not, there's an excellent series that Ava DuVernay has done on this actual thing. It's called When They See Us, and you can see that on Netflix. So we kind of know where Trump stands on this issue of death penalty. He comes off as this guy who's hard on crime. He's, just very, very no holds barred with regard to that. But it seems like Trump and former Attorney General Barr accelerated that death machine towards the end of his term. So we're talking about between July 2020 and this month, 13 persons who were on death row were executed. Is there any particular reason for this seemingly sudden interest in these executions? And did Barr actually push for those executions to happen, or was he just carrying out Trump's bidding? Anyone can jump in and answer that.
Well, I will let Maurice see if he has any inside journalist information about exactly who pushed for them. But, you know, I think that this is an issue, as you laid out, Rico, that we knew going into the administration was of great concern. That then President Trump did have a desire to carry out executions based on a very early incident with the Central Park Five, exonerated five now. And even through the course of his presidency, there were times where he hinted about the use of the death penalty for those who were associated with drug trafficking, which is included in the Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994, but it's not, we don't see a lot of people on death row because of that. So, you know, as far as in my assessment of the situation, there's so much harm that President Trump caused to the US over the last 4 years, and really the globe, with his recklessness and disregard for human life and for decency. And regrettably, executions are something that can't be undone. And so whatever of his legacy remains as we move forward towards a union we'd like to be, there's nothing that can be done to bring back the lives of those people that were executed by the federal government. And so that's one of the reasons that we believe he carried them out, is to sort of really attach that with his role in history, in American history. But I'd love to hear what Maurice thinks about it.
I completely agree that there was a sense in which it feels like legacy building, right? That it was, there had been, you know, 60 and a few more people on federal death row. And it was sort of an opportunity for Trump to kind of break away, not just from Obama, but also even from previous Republican presidents, and sort of lay claim to one area where it was frankly kind of easy for him. I mean, in a sense that he could sort of direct William Barr and the DOJ to pursue these executions and make them happen, and sort of get the points with his base for doing it. But, you know, all the steps that led these people to, you know, actually be executed sort of started years before under other presidents. And so a lot of advocates have sort of pointed out that it was actually Biden, you know, who was integral to the writing of these bills in Congress that made it possible for these men and one woman to get death sentences. And then it was attorney generals and DOJ lawyers under Obama and Clinton and Bush that actually pushed these cases through, right, and sought death sentences, and then handled the appeals and fought defense lawyers sort of at every turn and made them happen. So there were a lot of people who were kind of vulnerable to being executed on death row and just sort of waiting. And I mean, throughout the country, there are hundreds and hundreds of people in this position, and then it takes sort of a governor, or in this case, a president, to sort of prioritize it and push it through. Another aspect of this all that I found sort of fascinating, and I'm curious for your reaction to, is that Trump, you know, ordered Barr to push through these executions, but he didn't sort of brag about it the way that he had maybe bragged about his support for the death sentences for the exonerated five, and the way he brags about sort of everything when he sort of makes these sort of rambling speeches to his supporters. He barely brought it up. Most of the reason we know so much about these executions and the people who were executed is because journalists and advocates on the left who opposed executions were the ones sort of telling the public about them and beating the drum and trying to stop them. They were unsuccessful, but I do think that catalyzed the combination of Trump not talking about it and the sort of catalyzing influence of all these people sort of talking about all the problems with these executions, sort of, for me, come together into an image of this being a kind of last hurrah of a punishment that sort of many other metrics suggest is on the decline. It hasn't disappeared, but it's seemingly on a downward slope.
Okay. So
yeah, if I could just respond really quickly. I mean, I think you're right that he didn't make nearly as much of a fuss about the federal executions as so many other things that he seemed to be proud of that really go against the grain of what we know, support American values of human decency and justice. And, you know, the very first one of those executions, the man who was subject to execution, Daniel Lee, his lawyers had identified that the grandmother and mother of one of the victims actually was a Trump supporter. And she directly appealed in a video, multiple videos, to the president, said, meet with me, save this man, I don't want to see him dead. And I have to believe that had some impact on how he then chose to speak about it, because that's sort of, in my mind, feels like the perfect reason, since he's claiming that this is really about the victims and delivering justice, that this not just someone who, you know, is a murder victim's family member, but someone who has expressed support for him as a voter, and wanted to, and even expressed wanting to vote for him again. So it made it a little bit difficult. I will note he did, though, after some of the executions were carried out in campaign materials, he did send out emails say, like, we've delivered justice, right, after those first 3 executions were carried out. And I think it's, you know, more than curious that these executions happened in the timeline with the election versus the prior years of his administration. And so I won't opine further on that, but I think it's worth considering the timing that he used for the executions, particularly given that in this election cycle, almost all of the Democratic candidates professed that they oppose the death penalty. So this was one way that he was not only different from them, but willing to carry out this punishment.
Okay. So my question would be, the next question would be to both of you as well. Recently, Sonia Sotomayor very publicly objected to these rash of executions in a tweet. She had actually done posted several tweets to her account. But she also argued in 2017 in a case, and I quote, she said, "In addition to being near instant, death by shooting may also be comparatively painless. And historically, the firing squad has yielded significantly fewer botched executions." So it seems like there's a bit of a hypocritical point of view there. And then also, I guess that dovetails into another point that we'll bring up later about the actual introduction of firing squads, or the allowing of firing squads as a mode of execution. But I guess the question for now would be, could the Supreme Court have blocked any of these executions? And also, who can intervene if not in any of these executions? Do petitions work?
Kristina, I'm happy to let you take that one first. I have some thoughts on it, but.
Oh, sure. So I think on the case you're referencing, the Arthur case, you know, I think it's important to understand that it is the attorneys who represent these people that are subject to execution. It is their job to keep their clients alive. And sometimes the arguments they make to try to stop that person from being killed on a set execution date are not arguments that support abolishing the death penalty. In fact, majority of the time they're not, because they're saying this particular case of their client bears these errors, which is why the punishment shouldn't be carried through, because it will cause irreparable harm to their client, right? And so I'm not saying that there are likely not lawyers that that work to defend those on death row or subject to execution who, you know, hold abolitionist views as well, but traditionally in the legal documents, that's not what we see. And I think in Justice Sotomayor's case that you're referencing, I think she's actually referencing another case, and that particular case was about the method of execution. And so it wasn't so much like the Supreme Court was examining whether this alternative suggested method of execution, which no doubt this individual's attorney had suggested as a means to delay the execution, was like another thing to be considered. So I want to first note that. But as far as you know, the means of execution and what we sort of saw out of the Trump administration, DOJ, it took effect on November 27th, or it was final on November 27th, and not, in fact, we didn't really see it come into play in these January executions. But the manner of execution in the US, the main manner of execution is lethal injection, and that is the way in which the Trump administration carried out these 13 executions. They used a one-drug protocol of pentobarbital, which is what's used in Texas, which I'm sure Maurice can talk a lot more about. And while there are states that maintain other methods or modalities of execution, traditionally in the modern era, in recent years, they've been going with that. Recently, Tennessee has used electrocution over that, but in some states that have multiple means of execution, the person who is subject has the ability to choose something else if they'd like to. This is all very individualistic depending on the state. So I'm carefully not making a broad generalization of what it looks like. And so that's also something to take into consideration. the sort of really important and prominent point about what was so dangerous about that rule is not just that it invites these, arcane means to be used to execute people, that like gas or nitrogen hypoxia or firing squads or other things, but also that it really removed an important piece of review that a court would have, and that would effectively speed up an execution that faster than they would take place normally at the federal level. And so that was also quite dangerous. Now, we didn't actually see that tool used, but the sort of guise that it was hid behind was the idea that, well, now that there are 22 states, including Washington, D.C., that don't have executions, and therefore they don't have an execution method, where else can we pull from what methods can be used from other states' lethal injection or execution protocols, right? But I think there were more insidious things happening there, which hopefully the Biden administration will act quickly to rescind, because that is wholly within their authority at this point.
Yeah, another thing I want to say about Sotomayor's point, and I'm not sure if this was precisely the case where she was making this point, but there's sort of a long history of opponents of the death penalty, people who want to abolish it, sort of almost rhetorically calling out like the hypocrisy in the way that supporters of the death penalty sort of embrace methods like lethal injection that seek to kind of put it behind closed doors and make it quiet and make it look like the death of this person look like almost a medical procedure as opposed to the sort of state killing that it actually is, right? So in the early 1970s, when Texas was debating, the Texas legislature was debating whether to bring back the death penalty, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion because most of the legislators supported it. But this one legislator named Craig Washington, who later went to Congress, got up and he said, I have an amendment for this bill. We're going to bring back the death penalty, fine, but here's my amendment. I want to put the electric chair in the middle of the state House of Representatives chamber, and every single time there's going to be an execution, I want you all to be called into session and vote yourselves on this particular execution. Push the button, and then you'll sit there and you'll watch this man be executed. And at the time it was well known that electric chair executions, much like firing squads, were sort of much harder to watch, much grislier. And Washington wanted everyone, he knew he would lose this argument and that this was basically just a rhetorical point, but he sort of wanted everyone to feel the full kind of tension and the full kind of horror in what they were actually voting for and doing. And he didn't want them to sort of offload responsibility by saying, oh, well, it happens in this little, chamber in Huntsville, Texas at a prison that has nothing to do with me, right? That story has kind of resonated with me over the years as you see states turn away from firing squads and electric chairs and even hanging, which existed until not too long ago, and have embraced lethal injection, which, as I've said, kind of takes the horror out of it, at least sort of superficially, and allows people to sort of make the death penalty and executions seem more clinical, seem more dignified, even though, ultimately it's not that different from a firing squad, it's killing someone.
Okay, so with regard to the folks that were actually executed, it seems like in terms of the racial division, half of the prisoners executed under the federal death penalty since July were Black men. One was an indigenous man. Is there any data as to the racial makeup of individuals sentenced to death row, both federal or state? And can the panelists speak to any racial bias that may be present in death row sentencing?
Yeah, I'm sure that Maurice and I could cover this for the full hour, but I'll just say briefly that, when we look at federal death row, it was curious that in those first, I think it was the first 5 of the executions, well, 4 of them were white men, and the final was Lesmond Mitchell, who's an indigenous man, that they were all, Caucasian white men, understanding that the makeup of federal death row is something like 40% Black. It's definitely majority people of color, and of the people of color, the majority of them are Black men. And so while, of course, for context, Black people make up 13% of the US population, and we see pretty similar patterns of this, like in other states, and especially really we look at who was executed and the race of the victim as well, about the chances of execution increasing, particularly for Black defendants when the race of the victim is white. And there's really, I think, an important historical line to be drawn from the era of slavery and hanging and lynching, especially with white women being the victim and Black men then being put to death for the crime, whether they did it or not. And that we see that played out in a death penalty. And in some ways, we think about, Rodney Reed's case, for example, just a couple years ago was a case where he was accused of murdering and raping a white woman that it came to light that he had like a secret romantic relationship with her, but, was convicted by a jury who, felt strongly about the racial aspect of what was happening there. And thankfully, his execution was stopped. But it's difficult for us to really separate the racial tensions and bias that people have at all phases of the trial, where we're talking about the race of the person who is the victim, we're talking about the jury themselves and the defendant as well. And so there's very clear, and a lot of studies that conclude that racial bias is important. And in fact, Washington State, their Supreme Court ruled their death penalty unconstitutional because it was used in a racially biased way. That was the first line of the decision. So it continues to prove itself to be true, whether or not we want to face that fact as Americans.
Yeah, one story that I often sort of find my mind going back to is, mentioning this kind of connection, that Kristina brought up between lynching and the later death penalty. There were cases sort of in the early 20th century that were technically sort of legal cases where somebody, committed murder and was arrested and sentenced in court and then, executed in an official way by the state, but they looked a lot like the lynchings that were at the very same time happening. And so, if you were from the future and you visited, one of these small Texas towns in the early 20th century in the time travel machine or something, you would not really be able to tell the difference between the legal executions and the illegal lynchings. There was one case where a man was sentenced in a trial. The whole trial lasted 4 hours, and from inside the courtroom, he could hear the sound of like saws and hammers outside because they were building the scaffold to hang him while the trial was still going on, right? So, and this was a legal execution. Fast forward to the 1980s, and scholars started to look at this in a really kind of in-depth way, where they would look at hundreds of death penalty cases, and they would try to factor out, everything that wasn't race, to try to just isolate that one factor, take out try to like account for, the particular type of crime and gender and sort of all these other things. And they found a very slight increase in terms of the likelihood that you would get the death penalty if you were Black, but there was really astonishing jump if the victim was a white woman, no matter the race of the defendant. It was something like 4 times more likely that the defendant would get the death penalty if it was a white woman who had been murdered. And this sort of, again, speaks to the sort of historical continuum with lynchings, in which the ideology around lynchings was very much about this idea that white women were sort of these unique victims that we needed to protect through this really harsh punishment.
Okay, well, speaking to that, with regards to crime and the death penalty, has there been any evidence to support that it's a deterrent at all?
It has been tried many times to be proven and never satisfactorily. Sort of, there's been this kind of like, debate among sociologists and criminologists about whether you can really prove that it's a deterrent. But none of those studies have ultimately sort of been accepted by the larger scholarly community as being valid, right? So the simple answer is no. I don't know if Kristina has more to say on it.
Not much. There's definitely have been studies that I think conclude that it's inconclusive that it is the death penalty serves as a deterrent, or they're unable to come to that determination. And certainly we would see that it is not a deterrent, which I think really throws a wrench into some of these arguments that politicians will make as to why we need to keep the punishment available. Is that if we don't make an example of those who commit the worst crimes in our system by putting them to death, and what what are we telling society about ourselves and how, the treatment of others? And I think that's just not proven to be correct, that being tough on crime has any correlation with the death penalty, in fact, because it doesn't, in fact, deter crime. Has yet to been proven to do so. So yeah, I agree with what Maurice has to say there.
So Kristina, you had mentioned a little earlier a case in which the actual person that was sentenced was accused of a rape, but it turned out to be potentially consensual. We just saw recently the case of Eddie Lee Howard, who was a death row inmate that was recently exonerated due to evidence proving that he was actually innocent. But it took about 2 decades for that to happen. What's the history of wrongfully convicted individuals on death row?
Well, unfortunately, we have a pretty rough history of that. In the modern era of the death penalty, in 2019, we exceeded 1,500 executions nationwide. And right now, I think we stand at 174 people that have been exonerated from death rows around the country. And so the odds aren't great, but about 1 in 25 people on death row are innocent. And so the sad part of it is that many of those people, you know, may never get off of death row or may be executed. We don't know how many innocent people we have executed in our history. And so it takes a lot of really diligent work of the legal community to prove, you know, once executions, before someone is sort of exhausted their appeals, that their client is innocent and shouldn't be on death row anymore. And we just don't see that resourced in the same way, which is why I think it takes such a long time traditionally for someone to get off of death row, especially when it's not like their execution is coming in the next like day or two, right? And their lawyers are arguing with sort of increased media attention and activism around a particular case that their client didn't do it. That's, I think, a much different situation than when someone just is on death row and they're continuing to try to make that case in a less time-sensitive manner. But our data, our stats don't really speak highly of our ability to suss out determining who is in fact innocent. And from Amnesty's perspective, certainly, you know, the only way to eliminate the possibility of executing an innocent person is to get rid of the death penalty altogether. That's just unquestionable. That's the only way that we'll have 100% no executions of innocent people, is eliminate the death penalty as a punishment.
Absolutely, agreed. You have anything to add, Maurice?
Well, one thing that's kind of disturbed me over the years is that, you know, there are polls that ask people if they support the death penalty, and those polls, you know, have ranged quite a bit, but there tend to be over 50%. But there's also been an increase in the number of people who, while saying they support the death penalty, also say they think we've probably executed an innocent person. And so there's this thought, I think, that even if you were to prove it, some people would think, well, you know, people die in car accidents, but we're not going to ban cars, which, like, I think is sort of a specious argument, but because these are not accidents, right? But the fact is that it's been very hard to sort of use the innocence issue to sort of ultimately prove to people that death penalty is unjust, and partially that's because, you know, you have so many cases where there really isn't any doubt about guilt, and so then the debate about whether to execute them tends to turn on sort of other issues like their, you know, life background, whether that background was, you know, shown to the jury adequately, et cetera. But you know, I completely agree with Kristina that we don't know how many innocent people have been executed. There's very, very good evidence for you know, at least a half dozen or so. And over the years, you know, as investigators sort of keep working on it, we'll probably hear about more.
Okay. So with regard to, so first, I think it's probably important for us to make sure that we make it clear, make a clear distinction for all in attendance about the difference between state and federal death penalty. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Sure, I can just quickly say that. So Kristina might not have the exact figure, but it's between 25 and 30 states have the death penalty on the books. And the federal government technically has the death penalty on the books. A lot of states don't have the death penalty at all. Michigan, I always tell people, abolished the death penalty in the 1850s, right? So there are some places in America where there's just no death penalty at all. And the only death sentences You know, for example, the Boston Marathon bombing, a very famous case, Massachusetts didn't have the death penalty. So the only way in which Tsarnaev was able to get a death sentence was because federal prosecutors brought a case against him. Federal death penalty prosecutions are much more rare than state ones. The vast majority of people on death row are in states. And then at the state level, there's variation. So as I said, there are states that don't have it. There's states that do have it. But there's a big difference between, you know, states like Texas that carry out, you know, more than a dozen executions every year, have hundreds of people on death row, very actively sort of attempt to carry out these executions. And then you have a lot of states where scholars use the word symbolic, that the death penalty is on the books, people are sentenced to death, they're technically at risk of execution, but there's very little interest politically or socially in actually carrying out execution. So what practically ends up happening is a death sentence becomes kind of a de facto life sentence, and people sit on death row for years. This is the case in most part in California, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and so there's really a wide range. And so when you talk about the states that really carry out the death penalty very actively, it's a pretty small number, and it no longer appears as an actual majority of the country.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just expand a little to say, you know, I think what's striking about the federal death penalty is that while I think it's easy marketing to suppose that those who end up subject to federal death sentences as opposed to ones at the state level did something egregiously more heinous than those who serve federal death sentences. And that's not necessarily true. And it bears the same errors that we see at the state level as well, about, you know, at the trial phase, errors happening where improper mitigation is done. People who may have intellectual or mental disabilities aren't ever properly examined and juries don't hear about it. There's still racial bias that occurs in these trials too. There are people on federal death row right now, Black people that were never that were tried by all white juries. And that just is not a jury of our peers. We just have to be honest about that. And while in 1994, the Federal Death Penalty Act greatly expanded the universe of crimes that made the federal death penalty offense, or became death eligible rather, you know, I think some of these seem really arbitrary. Like some of the folks who were executed in this most recent spate, really what made their crimes eligible for the federal death penalty as opposed to the state is the actual location that it took place. It happened to be on federal grounds, right? And that is a pretty arbitrary distinction, in fact. And so while the purpose of federal law is supposed to be to sort of universalize or federalizing something, is idea that we should all serve under the same standards, but I don't think that these are good ones at all, which is no doubt why we see active attempts to abolish the federal death penalty underway in Congress right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So actually, Maurice, you mentioned a little bit about, I guess, the lack of social motives to carry out executions. Would this be one of the reasons why the federal government has not executed a death row inmate in 17 years?
It's part of the picture. You know, my understanding is that the Obama administration was not so willing to sort of go out on a limb and abolish the death penalty or commute the sentences of people on death row or anything like that. But there was very little political appetite to actually carry out executions and to sort of take these cases where the appeals had kind of gotten to a fairly far point, sort of run their course, and actually try to go ahead with the executions. And you see a similar dynamic in, you know, states like I said, Pennsylvania. You know, it's a lot of states where you have maybe a Democrat in the governor's seat, a state Supreme Court that has a lot of Democrats on it. They're not necessarily, they're maybe like Joe Biden used to be, right? They're not absolutely gung-ho about the death penalty, but they're also not interested in sort of actively taking the political risk to try to abolish it like they did in Washington State. So I think that 17-year gap, there's a lot of explanations for it that are sort of in the weeds, but one of them is that the 8 years of Obama, there just like was not the sort of will in terms of the administration to carry out these executions, especially after, I believe it was in 2014, that there was a very kind of famous botched execution and it went really terribly wrong. It was, you know, the news about it, it was out of Oklahoma. It was a state execution, but it was sort of such a kind of horror show and full of so many mistakes that it made the national news. And Obama came out and talked about how uncomfortable he was with the death penalty and executions, and that kind of gave you a lens in that he was not sort of pushing Eric Holder or Loretta Lynch or any of these high up legal officials in administration to make executions a priority, because he understood that there were problems.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to take a moment to encourage all attendees to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A section, because in a few moments, we'll be wrapping up this conversation with Maurice and Kristina, and we'll give you an opportunity to have any questions that you have answered by the two of them. So moving right along, I just wanted to talk a little bit about abolition work. Kristina, obviously Amnesty International has done a lot of that with regard to the death penalty. Can you speak to the history of death row abolition movements in the United States? Have they made any progress? I know that Virginia recently just introduced a bill.
Now I'm unmuted. Amnesty has worked to abolish the death penalty globally for over 40 years. When we started the work, there were 16 countries that were abolitionists in law and practice, and now there's, I think, 105 or 106. And so the US is now sort of in a minority of countries that continues to seek this ultimate punishment and truly carry it out. I know it may seem alarming to some folks that I speak to in the US, but my colleagues abroad are always up in arms when they hear about the executions taking place, and their membership, the folks in other countries, are absolutely appalled with the US's use of the death penalty. And so outside of this sort of global context, in the US, we have also made a lot of progress in eliminating this punishment. Now, as Maurice mentioned, there are states that haven't had a death penalty since like the 1800s. And so those aren't really ones that we have to worry so much about, but there are a lot of states that have eliminated, as noted in the chat here. Someone says there are 22 states without a death penalty, including DC. And in recent years, we've continued to see that progress. Last year in 2020, Colorado ended the death penalty, and Governor Jared Polis also commuted the sentences of those that were on death row because the bill was only prospective, not retroactive. Before that, New Hampshire eliminated the death penalty. They overrode a veto from the governor and the legislature to do so. Right before that, Washington State Supreme Court ruled their death penalty unconstitutional, and there have been a number of other states in recent years that have steadily come in to do so. I'm from Virginia, so I deeply care, and I'm glad to see that it may become the first Southern state to really eliminate the death penalty. The bill made it out of the first big barrier, the Senate Judiciary Committee, on January 18th. It's obviously something Amnesty supports. And, we are hopeful, and it's a pretty interesting setup. The governor himself actually is a patron of the legislation, which we really don't see governors putting their name behind legislation. And it's, of course, carried by members of the House and the Senate as well in the state. But assuming that a lot of efforts and thought has gone behind it, I think we're hopeful about what could happen in Virginia in this legislative session, and other states around the country as well. We have seen more of a pattern with some states in the West that haven't had as much of a historical tie to the death penalty because they don't have the same history with sort of slavery and lynching and racial bias in the same way, because they're just less racially diverse as well, that have made significant strides. And in some of those states where the general population may be more conservative leaning, they have made really successful cases. In that, I saw in the chat someone asked about the cost of the death penalty, and that particularly in some of these states, they're not really killing people. They just have people sitting on death row, not even very many of them. And the cost of keeping them there, the guards, the actual legal fees that may be associated if they haven't exhausted appeals, are quite expensive. And that money, there's a fair argument to be made that money could go towards victims of other crimes if their sentences were just reduced and they were, either exonerated or moved elsewhere, right? And so that is one argument that folks make in opposition to the death penalty, the argument that, government doesn't always get things right. We as people don't get things right. So why should we be using this punishment at all? Which is in some ways about innocence, but it's also a bit of a libertarian argument that we don't want big government making these decisions about people's lives. And some of these things are quite convincing, in addition to the reasons that Amnesty feels are important, that it's a violation of human rights to kill people, for our government to sort of take away life, which it cannot ultimately give. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, you talked about cost, which is like my favorite, not my favorite subject, but I spent a lot of time researching the cost question a few years ago. And so sort of kind of got obsessed with thinking about it. And you're right that there were a lot of Western states where the kind of cost arguments about the death penalty appealed to sort of small government conservatives who believe that, you know, the government should spend as little money as possible and the taxpayers should have to pay as few taxes as possible. And this even played out in the context of like individual cases where you would have small towns, and this was not just in the West, this also happened in Texas and it happened in Arizona, Colorado, where you know, people realized that taking someone to for prosecutors to seek to sentence somebody to death, they had to pay so much in terms of experts in court and investigators and the legal fees for the defense, that these cases were costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And I had one like county official tell me that he compared a death penalty trial to a flood or a tornado in the way that like it kind of wiped out the local budget, and basically the entire year's budget had to go to this, and they even had to raise taxes on the citizens of these smaller towns in order to pay for the death penalty. And so eventually prosecutors started saying, you know, this person might deserve the death penalty. We're not sort of making any moral argument here, but we just cannot afford it. It's not a fiscally responsible thing to do. So I think that's been a really interesting way in which the death penalty has sort of been challenged, not from the kind of moral or religious sort of side, but from the sort of very practical, very sort of fiscal conservative side. I also just want to say on this subject of activism and what people can do, I saw there was a question in the chat about what people can do. Of course, there are always the sort of typical ways of reaching out to your legislators and following federal legislation and, you know, asking your elected representatives to prioritize this. A lot of death sentences, the sort of first step in the whole process is that a district attorney, the sort of top prosecutor for a county, is the one who makes a decision about whether an individual case is going to be a death penalty case, whether the death penalty is even going to be on the table in the first place, or whether they're just going to seek a prison sentence, right? And over the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen a lot of district attorney elections in big cities throughout the country, in Houston and Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, where the death penalty has been a major issue and a major thing that people vote on, where, you know, one candidate says, I'm never going to seek the death penalty, or I'm going to seek it very rarely, and the other candidate is maybe more willing to continue seeking it. This kind of thing doesn't apply to New York City, where the death penalty doesn't exist, the state doesn't exist. But for anyone, you know, who visits or has relatives in or lives in sort of another one of these communities, I always sort of encourage people to find out who the district attorney is and find out what kinds of decisions they're making about death sentences. Are they seeking death sentences? Is someone challenging them in the next election who says they don't want to seek them? This applies in sort of a surprising number of urban areas and rural and conservative areas too.
If I could follow up on that, I mean, I'll say, to Maurice's point, what's really interesting about the use of the death penalty is that not only while there are states that do and do not have the punishment, it's also really oftentimes geographically concentrated. And that's really based off of who is the person who is the district attorney. For many years, Harris County, Texas was sort of like the leading county to like put forth death sentences, right? And so the changing of the guard of the person who's able to make that decision or influence lawyers in that county or prosecutors in that county, whether or not they're going to seek it or not, just because the punishment's still in the book doesn't require the lawyers representing the government to actually pursue it. It doesn't have to be a priority. And again, when we think about what the Biden administration can do, they can make that directive that DOJ attorneys like cease to seek the death sentence, the death penalty. They could just decide to do that with a stroke of a pen. As far as, and now we see sort of in California and LA, George Gascon, who was elected in this most recent DA election cycle, he was very loud and proud about his opposition of the death penalty and really trying to get people off the row and make reforms, really important reforms to the criminal penal system. And, I've heard that he's literally like being subject to people are trying to recall election him because of what significant changes he's trying to make to sort of repair the harm that has been done by his predecessor and others before her. And so that is a very real way that one can take action in their locality to make decisions about what their criminal justice system looks like. Of course, with regard to the federal and the state piece, in Virginia, if you happen to be calling in from Virginia, even though I know y'all are New York focused, the Senate bill is 1165 and the House bill is 2263. The Senate is still considering the bill. So if you want to call your senator and your delegate, I'm sure that, and you are a constituent, please feel free to do so. And you can probably look that up on Virginia's website. With the federal legislation, we have two bills. We're lucky to have not one, but two different sponsors who care deeply about eliminating the death penalty. One from New York, Congressman Adriano Espaillat. His bill is HR 97, and it seeks to eliminate the death penalty. It also then allows for those who would be under sentence of death at the time of enactment to be resentenced. There is another bill that does exactly the same thing from Congresswoman in Massachusetts, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who I'm sure many of you have heard of as well. She is pushing a bill that would do the same, partnering with Senator Durbin, who is from Illinois, and he is also the Senate Judiciary Chair. So we're quite excited that we have so much enthusiasm for this issue at the federal level. So it is absolutely within your power right now to just look up who your member of Congress is and make a phone call to their office and say, I care about this, you need to be on these bills. Her bill is HR 262. The other one is HR 97 before Congress. And, with all of this conversation, these federal executions that have just concluded just before this new administration has taken place, and a very serious campaign commitment from now President Biden, we really do hope to see some changes in the right direction on this issue in a matter of weeks.
There's almost an irony to me that Trump, in carrying out all these executions, has kind of galvanized opponents, and maybe ultimately we'll see the sort of decision of his to carry out these executions as the sort of the thing that sparked and caused all of this momentum to eventually lead to federal abolition, which I think would be very ironic.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned earlier, Maurice, that there have been, previous administrations who have legislatively kind of laid the bricks for what we're dealing with now with regard to these death penalty sentences. What can we, including Biden? So now that he's in office officially, what can we expect? And both of you can just answer this, very briefly, and we'll get into the questions from the attendees. What can we expect from the new administration? Kristina, you mentioned that, he had made some promises, but given the track record of Biden and the crime bill and the things of that nature that a lot of people have been bringing up during the election, and also the new AG, what can we expect?
Well, I think there's been a pretty active and vocal coalition of folks who have weighed in with the administration during this transition period, and are continuing to do so as the Biden administration has just begun, just yesterday. And so there certainly are a number of things within the executive authority. You're 100% right that, of course, then Senator Biden held different views about this punishment and, had a very heavy hand of involvement with the 1994 crime bill, which did include the Federal Death Penalty Act. So let's not pretend that there isn't a very upsetting record of folks of the president on this issue. But he has the opportunity now to really change that. And so, we're asking, and I think a lot of others are as well, both organizations at the national level and hundreds of grassroots organizations have written and said, listen, you can dismantle the execution chamber on federal death row. You can cease to seek federal death sentence. You can withdraw authorization from any pending death penalty cases. And there are, I think, dozens of them happening right now. And those are things that can be done. They can withdraw or undo the lethal injection protocol and the manner of execution regulation that we spoke about earlier. So there are definitely, and of course, one really important, very powerful thing that the administration could do is President Biden could grant clemency to the people that are on federal death row. I know that's something that Congresswoman Pressley is pushing for with Congresswoman Bush as well. And so those are all within the administration's authority. We will continue to ask for these things. While it's great that we no longer have an executive, a president who is so bloodthirsty and seeking these executions, whether shame or whatever reason change in President Biden's opinion, I do have to believe he will do something, maybe not the full list of things, but that we will see something out of this administration, because what they have shown us so far in just the first, 72 hours, not even 48, is they have kept some of their campaign commitments. And so it's just a question of what it will look like.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know much to add. I think it is really a question of sort of how far he'll go. There are, as you said, much more dramatic measures he could take, and they're sort of much simpler, much smaller ones. And I think this is another area where it kind of depends on what kinds of pressure he's getting, what he feels like he has to do politically. I think that, the more sort of skeptical version of me tends to see Biden, and really anybody who becomes president, is like, very much subject to the sort of political interests and the kind of pushes and pulls are getting. Just one more factor that I've been hearing about that I find very interesting and something to watch is that, one thing that Trump did outside of the criminal justice system is, allow relationships with European countries to really break down. He had a very frosty relationship with Angela Merkel and a lot of these sort of European leaders. And Biden will be traveling throughout Europe and the world trying to sort of repair some of these relationships. And I've heard people say that one thing that these European leaders hope to do, some of them, and would really sort of help is for them to say to Biden, one thing you can do to really recommit America to the kind of shared values of human rights and democracy that you have sort of share with Europe is to abolish the death penalty and to sort of join Europe, which now has not had the death penalty for many years. I don't know if that kind of political pressure will work, but it's sort of an interesting other direction that you can imagine Biden getting pressure on this issue.
Thanks for that. Okay, so we've wrapped our conversation with our panelists. We'll just go ahead and get into the questions from our attendees. Nikhil is asking, given that some of the scaffolding for the executions under Trump were built under Clinton and Obama administrations, what are some of the tangible policy steps that are being considered to dismantle said scaffolding?
I think it's mostly what Kristina, just said. These sort of different steps that would make it harder for a future administration to carry out executions. So if you commute the sentences of everybody on federal death row, you change their sentences to, it would primarily be, I think, life in prison. These people would all go to prison, and you couldn't sort of bring them back to death row and try to execute them again. Death sentences would only happen to sort of new people, right? Biden can stop seeking seeking death sentences for people, who are awaiting trial and sort of the earlier stages of their case, and he can direct the Attorney General to do this. He can dismantle the execution chamber and the entire kind of machinery around lethal injection, so that it's not impossible for a future administration to carry out executions, but a lot more effort and work, and sort of barring somebody who's really gung-ho like President Trump, it sort of just makes it that much more unlikely that it'll happen again.
Thank you. So the next question is coming from Luis. Actually, Kristina, you answered a great deal of this, but he also wanted to know, is there also a push for capital punishment for cop killers? And can these individuals really be rehabilitated?
Well, as someone who also works on use of lethal force from law enforcement, we definitely do see this as an issue in states where people on death row have, that person has killed a law enforcement officer. And it is, without a doubt, a harder case to make that someone whose job is to defend society, in theory, if they are killed, that individual should spend time on death row. But, again, when we look at the deterrent arguments, they're just, the data is not there that suggests that the death penalty really keeps anyone safer. In New Hampshire, there were law enforcement officials, former law enforcement officials. There was one person on death row, and he was on death row for the murder of a cop, who said, you know what, we don't think the death penalty has a place in New Hampshire anymore. And just the other day in Virginia, there are two men on death row there. And I don't know if both of them, but at least one of them is on death row for killing a law enforcement officer. And some of the family oppose eliminating the death penalty, and which shows, I think it's important. While I spoke earlier about victims who may say, I don't feel like this punishment is compatible with what happened to my loved one. Obviously, I wish they were still alive, but this isn't going to bring me any kind of justice. There are folks who feel differently about that in the murder victims family category. but it's not clear that the death penalty prevents or serves as a deterrent for those sorts of crimes.
One other just little anecdote I want to mention in this context is that there have also been a handful of examples of people who kill police officers getting life sentences instead of the death penalty at trial because their defense lawyers managed to basically convince a jury of citizens, right, to sort of spare their lives. An example that I learned a lot about in my book research was in Houston about 10 years ago. It was in 2006, there was a man named Juan Quintero who killed a police officer named Rodney Johnson. This was in Houston, which, like Kristina said earlier, was kind of the death penalty capital of the United States for these years. And Quintero, the defendant, was undocumented, and he had previously been deported after a sexual assault charge. So it was really sort of all of the things, so sort of societally, ideologically, were kind of lined up against him. And he had this very kind of brilliant defense lawyer who mounted an investigation of his life and went and sent a team into Mexico to sort of interview every family member, distant cousins, classmates, basically anyone who had ever known him, to kind of build this portrait of a young man who had struggled with abuse at home, become addicted to alcohol and other things, and had a brain injury, had sort of had this real struggle in life, and then in this one moment of panic, had a kind of fight or flight response kick in his brain, and his brain was kind of so kind of broken from these earlier experiences in life that he snapped and he shot this police officer and felt immensely remorseful for it. And the argument was not that we should excuse what he did or that he should be let out tomorrow or anything like that. She was just trying to get the jury to spare him the death penalty, to say that there's just enough of a sort of value in this man's life that he shouldn't go to death row. And the jury ended up agreeing with her. And it was a sort of big shock for Houston and for Texas that, this kind of case could not lead to the death penalty. But I see in that an example of how even in the most heinous crimes, there is sometimes a path to sort of see the people who commit these crimes with some degree of mercy, no matter how hard that is, and just enough mercy to say that it would be unjust to kill them.
So our last question comes from Miranda, and I'm guessing this is more or less a question about alternate modes of punishment under the law. With the abolition of the death penalty, how do you feel victims of more heinous crimes like first-degree murder or rape should receive justice?
This is a popular question, believe it or not. It's also one that a lot of time when I speak to student groups, they're like very interested in. Well, I would point to some examples that are around the world where there are countries that not only don't have a death penalty, they also don't have life in prison without parole. Maximum sentence is something like 20 years, 25 years. And so for Amnesty, we oppose the death penalty, full stop, no exceptions. Doesn't matter the method of execution, there is no reason the government should be carrying out executions or killing people. And we also oppose life in prison without parole, which is why we're so pleased to see these two bills before Congress that don't automatically make that the punishment, which is traditionally the case when states abolish the death penalty, is that becomes the default sentence. But those bills actually suggest that those individuals are worthy of resentence, that they should be resentenced, and that not all of them probably will be resentenced to life in prison without parole, right? Because we've already identified through this chat that there are so many errors with the system as it exists that there may be some people that committed very heinous crimes and we shouldn't excuse their crimes, but it's really up to us to make those case-by-case determinations, which is why I won't provide you a punishment that I think is what should be the most extreme punishment in society, because we really, are looking to the sort of international standards, and that, the purpose of putting someone in prison or in confinement is about rehabilitation. It's not about punishment. And by keeping someone there for the rest of their life or ending their life through the state, you're depriving them of the opportunity for that.
I also think that there's a growing movement in the US. It's very nascent, but there's a kind of concept called restorative justice. And this is where, the idea is that the crime was a kind of wound or a harm that has been, visited upon somebody, or in a case of murder, there's a sort of family members left behind. And those people want justice, and what justice means, can vary quite a bit. In past eras, as we've talked about, it's been the death penalty, but there's other cases where they want to kind of, make sure that the person's not going to do it again. And so they want, even if that means rehabilitation, they want to see kind of just proof that what happened to them isn't going to happen to anyone else. You see examples, they're rare but very interesting, where they meet with the person who committed the crime and ask them questions about what happened, and they find that they actually get something out of that that's very meaningful, and that kind of makes them, it doesn't make them completely whole again, but it helps. And you see these sorts of, it's sometimes called mediation, right, between prisoners and the people that they have harmed. So there's sort of a whole kind of, I don't know, movement sort of going on to explore what these other modes of response can look like that are not purely punishment, and that sort of orient our system away from thinking about how can we make this person hurt after they made someone else hurt, right? That we as a society want to sort of shift away from that, but it's slow, hard, difficult work, especially with very, very, serious, heinous crimes, the sort of worst crimes you can imagine. So it's not something that's going to be easy or happen in a day.
So in response to that, just briefly, what would you say to those who are on the side of rehabilitation and deterrence isn't the point, it's punishment? And so if the death penalty is the punishment that fits the crime, so to speak, then so be it.
Well, you got to try out all the arguments with someone that opposes, but I guess one important thing again to point to is whether the person in fact did commit the crime, is seeing the totality of that individual, and did our justice system even deliver them a fair trial? Because in so many of these cases, and Maurice pointed to some examples, which I'm sure there are many of in his forthcoming book, but so many of these individuals had like horrifically egregious errors in their cases, and to believe that it's fair and just for us to advance these, even if the person may have actually committed this crime, to kill them when like this person has an IQ that is below 60. This person has serious intellectual or mental disabilities, that's right. Our domestic laws say, as well as international laws say, that like if a person isn't aware of what the consequence of their execution is, then they should not be executed. And we look at these most recent federal executions, there were 2 of them where there were really serious, at least 2, maybe 3, where that they had very serious court challenges about that. And the federal government moved forward. And in one of the cases, the federal government even withheld evidence that they knew that this person had really serious mental capacity issues, and they just didn't care. And I just don't think that we can advance this punishment, this ultimate punishment, denying someone their life, when we know that these errors exist and are not fixable.
I also think that one, argument, this doesn't work with somebody who believes sort of purely in punishment necessarily, but as in that, Houston case I described, where the police officer was killed and this man was undocumented and really kind of like a villain in Houston, a lot came out of exploring all of the things that happened in this person's life, the sort of traumas. I mean, the federal case of Lisa Montgomery was probably the most dramatic example of this, where it was, this young woman, she was sexually assaulted by her stepfather as a child. She was, repeatedly abused by her mother. She had a severe mental illness. I mean, she didn't understand why she was being executed. Her crime was also very horrific. She murdered a pregnant woman and stole the fetus. It was like everything about it was horrible. But the argument that her defense lawyers were making was ultimately, this is basically the kind of point that they made to Trump in a clemency application that failed, was that sort of killers aren't born. They're sort of made through circumstances of their lives. And the question is not necessarily, does this person deserve the death penalty? But as sort of Brian Stevenson, a very sort of celebrated defense lawyer, has said, do we as a society deserve to kill them, given that we kind of created the conditions of poverty and, a lack of access to mental health resources, et cetera, that sort of produced, beat by beat, the path to this tragedy. I mean, in Lisa Montgomery's case and other cases, there's always all these people who come forward and say, we tried to get them help, we tried to do something, but the social services weren't there, the money wasn't there be no help, and we just like watched as this tragedy unfolded and eventually led to a murder. And again, we don't think this person necessarily should, be freed tomorrow with no rehabilitative resources, but that, you know, punishment is a very subjective thing, and the question of what somebody deserves is very subjective. And when you have the totality of their individual life circumstances, you may come to see them with a little bit more mercy.
And so in cases like the Lisa Montgomery case and so many others, then it becomes more of an indictment of society than an individual issue with regard to committing a crime. Thank you so much to Maurice Chammah and Kristina Roth. Your expertise is appreciated, as well as your work. We work in lockstep with you with all the things that you do. We really appreciate. And if you have any social media tags that you want to go ahead and throw in there, that people can follow you and follow the work that you do, you can go ahead and do that right now.
Sure, I'll do that. I'll also share a link to my book, which if anyone's interested in, it comes out next week. I've been working on it for about 5 years, and I'm very excited to put it into the world, but it explores a lot of the sort of themes and issues we've been talking about tonight.
Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Where can they find you on social media?
Oh, yeah, on Twitter.
Okay, so his Twitter handle would just be his first and last name. And Kristina?
I just dropped mine in the chat too. You can follow me at Chrissy_Roth. I know you call me Kristina, but everybody calls me Chrissy. I just, you know, respect the name my parents gave me in print, basically. So if you're ever looking for anything I've said, you should look for Kristina. But if you're talking to me, you can call me Chrissy. So that's my name on Twitter. And then you can follow Amnesty's work at Amnesty USA on Twitter. And that's where we're most active. So I recommend finding us there.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much, both of you, for your time and expertise. And if you have not heard, you can follow Street Riders at StreetRidersNYC on all platforms. Thank you so much, and tune in again next Thursday for our next panel discussion. Have a great night. Stay safe.
So long.
Thanks so much.